further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1341 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 96, H.R. 1341, a bill to require the Financial Stability Oversight Council to conduct a study of the likely effects of the differences between the United States and other jurisdictions in implementing the derivatives credit valuation adjustment capital requirement.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fincher, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, each will control 20 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous materials for the record on H.R. 1341 as amended, currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I want to thank Chairman Jeb Hensarling, Chairman Frank Lucas, and Chairman Scott Garrett for working with both Congressman David Scott and myself to bring H.R. 1341 to the floor for consideration today. I am pleased that we are considering H.R. 1341, the Financial Competitive Act of 2013. Mr. Scott and I have worked in a bipartisan manner to move this measure forward to ensure America remains competitive in the global marketplace. We need folks around the world to know America is open for opportunity, advancement, and upward mobility. In this country, we promote opportunity, not unfair regulations that punish business and kill jobs here. I introduced the Financial Competitive Act with my friend Mr. Scott for one reason: to ensure the law of unintended consequences does not place America at a disadvantage globally. Our bill simply requires Financial Stability Oversight Committee to conduct a study of the impacts implementing the Credit Valuation Adjustment Capital Requirement, or CVA, will have on the U.S. consumers, end users, and U.S. financial institutions. This study is in response to the recent Basel III Accord, which is a global regulatory standard for capital requirement for banks. Unfortunately, European Union Basel III regulators decided to exempt their own European banks from complying with certain provisions of Basel III. Specifically, European regulators have decided to exempt transactions with sovereign pension funds and corporate counterparties, which are also exempt from clearing obligations from CVA risk-weighted assets. This means European banks will not have to put up capital like American banks. I have some serious questions about the impact the European exemption will have on U.S. financial institutions, consumers, and larger U.S. companies, larger U.S. economy. To me, this exemption will provide a significant financial and business advantage to European banks, European customers, and European end users at the expense of American business, banks, and end users. Mr. Scott and I are not alone. Canada recently announced it will delay its CVA capital requirement for 1 year, even though it implemented the rest of the Basel III package on schedule. Canada's decision to delay implementation of the CVA requirement was simple. It was driven by concerns that Canadian banks would be at a competitive disadvantage because of the European CVA exemption. U.S. financial institutions and consumers share those same concerns and will be competitively disadvantaged, which will affect how these institutions serve consumers in the derivative business as well as the commercial loan business. Our bill will clarify the impact the CVA exemption for European financial institutions will have on the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy can't afford to wait while Europe takes valuable market share away from U.S. companies. If the U.S. doesn't act, this disadvantage could potentially cost the U.S. economy billions of dollars and lead to jobs moving overseas. It's simple. This bill is about America versus Europe. I urge you to support me in passing the Financial Competitive Act in order to ensure the law of unintended consequences doesn't place U.S. consumers, end users, and financial institutions at a disadvantage. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just last week, the government made an important step towards repairing our financial system after the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve adopted final rules implementing Basel III, including new capital requirements intended to bolster capital throughout the financial system. As losses mounted during the financial crisis, the woefully inadequate capital cushions at banks and others nearly brought our entire economy to a halt. I also appreciate that the bank regulators have taken a common-sense approach for which I had strongly advocated related to community banks, including the treatment of residential mortgages. I applaud the banking regulators for finalizing these critical rules, which along with the other Dodd-Frank reforms will create the conditions for a robust and resilient financial sector. This legislation before us today, H.R. 1341, requires the Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC, to conduct a study of the potential effects of any differences between the U.S. and other jurisdictions' implementation of one aspect of the Basel III Accords, the credit valuation adjustment capital requirement related to derivatives transactions. The Basel signatory countries rightly agreed that banks should hold capital against the possibility that their counterparties, be it an airline or another bank, would default. However, despite agreeing to do so under Basel III, the European Union has made a preliminary decision to exclude the credit valuation adjustment from the calculation of European banks' capital requirements. As a result of the EU dropping this requirement, some U.S. banks think that they may be disadvantaged relative to their international counterparts. Under the bill, the FSOC will study these and other differences between the regulators' implementation of this requirement. I agree that it is important for U.S. regulators to ensure that the way by which the CVA is calculated for domestic financial institutions includes an appropriate methodology that will not inadvertently create an unlevel playing field relative to foreign competitors. At the same time, we must be mindful not to engage in a global race to the bottom when it comes to capital requirements for our largest, most globally interconnected financial institutions. After all, the strength of the U.S. financial system is and will be based on its stability and transparency. Importantly, during consideration of the bill, Ms. Beatty of Ohio added language balancing the study scope. As a result, the FSOC study will also consider the effects that failing to implement the CVA would have on the stability of U.S. financial markets in a period of market stress, as well as how the regulators are fulfilling their statutory mandate to respond to emerging threats to financial stability. With the addition of this language, the bill study now balances not just the implications for derivatives market participants of this specific capital charge, but also the effects of our economic stability. Undercapitalized derivatives exposures were one of the major drivers of the 2008 financial crisis. Market participants should hold capital against the risk of a counterparty defaulting or entering bankruptcy. We can certainly consider how implementation of the CVA could best be accomplished, but again, we cannot engage in a global race to the bottom when it comes to capital rules. It is my hope that the FSOC will use the findings from this study to urge other global regulators to expeditiously adopt standards that are as strong as ours. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of time. Gentlewoman.
I have no additional speakers, Mr. Speaker, and I would close.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee.
I urge passage of 1341 and yield back the balance of my time.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1341 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion...
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.
We're going to switch managers. Mr. Hurt.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1564 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 103, H.R. 1564, a bill to amend the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 to prohibit the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board from requiring public companies to use specific auditors or require the use of different auditors on a rotating basis.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous materials for the record on H.R. 1564 as amended, currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1564, the Audit, Integrity, and Job Protection Act, a bipartisan bill I introduced with my colleague, Representative Meeks. I thank him for his leadership on this issue. If enacted, this bill would eliminate the threat of mandatory audit firm rotation by prohibiting the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, a self-regulatory organization charged with overseeing the auditors of public companies, from moving ahead with a potential rulemaking that would have serious negative consequences for American businesses, investors, and consumers. In 2011, the PCAOB issued a concept release to impose mandatory audit firm rotation, a directive requiring public companies to change their independent auditor every few years. Implementing this proposal would significantly impair the quality of public audits, reduce the supervision and oversight in audit committees, impose significant unnecessary costs, and impede investment, and harm investors and consumers. In fact, a GAO study conducted pursuant to Sarbanes-Oxley found that initial year audit costs under mandatory audit firm rotation would increase by more than 20% over subsequent year costs in order for the new auditor to acquire the necessary knowledge of the public company. Additionally, the GAO noted concerns about negative effects on audit quality during the initial years of a new audit firm's tenure. The consequences of the costs imposed by audit firm rotation would decrease access to capital and investments in our communities that help our local businesses get people back to work. Beyond harming the competitive position of the American public company, I have heard from private companies in Virginia's 5th District, including many of our biotech firms and our banks, that mandatory audit firm rotation would create one more disincentive to go public in light of the increased costs and an already complex regulatory scheme. Both the SEC and Congress have previously rejected mandatory audit firm rotation. Most recently, the Jobs Act explicitly banned audit firm rotation for emerging growth companies. In exerting its legislative prerogative to ensure this harmful policy was not enacted on these emerging companies, Congress took away this disincentive from companies exploring accessing the public markets. Now, Europe is considering imposing an audit firm rotation regime, in part because it believes that the United States will move forward on PCAOB's concept draft. Despite the overwhelming opposition to the concept release, over 90% of the more than 700 comments filed, the PCAOB has left this issue unresolved. To my knowledge, the concept release has not been withdrawn, nor have there been any statements from the PCAOB that it will not be moving forward with the proposal. This continued uncertainty is having a detrimental effect on American businesses. The decision of changing an audit firm is best left to companies' audit committees, not regulators who are trying to impose a one-size-fits-all approach. H.R. 1564 will make clear that Congress does not believe that mandatory audit firm rotation will provide additional protections to investors or consumers and will stifle growth of job-creating small businesses while decreasing audit quality. I'd like to thank Chairman Hensarling. I'd like to thank the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee for their support and leadership on this issue as we're able to achieve a unanimous bipartisan vote from the committee. I ask my colleagues to join me in voting yes on H.R. 1564 and pass this good bill from the House so that we may strengthen audit quality, remove the threat of unnecessary costs, and refocus the PCAOB on its mission to protect investors and the public interest by promoting informative, accurate, and most important, independent audit reports. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The 2008 financial crisis cost Americans more than $13 trillion, $13 trillion, leaving many families unable to make ends meet as they lost their jobs and saw their nest eggs disappear. 5 years later, as we began to pick up the pieces of a mess largely caused by deregulation, the American investing public is now much more cautious when investing its valuable savings. As a member of the Financial Services Committee, I see my job to ensure that there are appropriate rules in place that will hopefully prevent such a debacle from ever happening again. One such initiative to improve the functionality of our markets is to improve the independence of the market's fact checkers, the public company auditors. These companies play a vital role of validating the authenticity of companies' financial statements and keep all public companies honest when reporting to investors how they have performed. I applaud the government regulator of the auditors, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or PCAOB, for its persistent efforts to identify structural changes in the current system that may improve auditor independence. After all, we know that auditors generally performed poorly leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, failing to warn investors of the outside risk posed by banks' bets on the housing market. Having said that, I understand that one such proposal floated by the PCAOB, the mandatory rotation of auditors, has raised serious concerns that will significantly increase costs for companies as well as diminish the quality of information upon which investors base their investment decisions. For these reasons, I support H.R. 1564, which prohibits this proposal from being implemented. It is not clear to me that requiring a public company to change auditors ever so many years would contribute to auditor independence. What's more, given the time it takes an auditing firm to truly understand the business of a company, there will be at least a few years of less than ideal audits, as an auditor has to learn everything they need to know about the new firm. Additionally, the small number of major auditing firms, coupled with specialization within the auditing industry, means that requiring rotation in many cases will not leave companies with much choice at all. In my view, while enhancing auditor independence is a crucial goal, I do feel there may be better ways to accomplish it. I would also note that this bill does not in any way limit the ability of a company's audit committee to rotate its auditors. Such committees, as some investors have pointed out, are best suited to select their own auditors. Having said that, I do have concerns about tampering with the authority of a regulator when it raises an issue that we disagree with. The PCAOB asked the public for feedback on a range of proposals, all targeting the concern that auditors have become too close and dependent on the companies they are supposed to examine. It's not unreasonable for the PCAOB to include this as one of a large range of issues it's examining. To address this concern with the bill, I offered an amendment during our markup of H.R. 1564 that requires the GAO to update its previous study regarding auditor rotation. The previous GAO study, completely shortly after the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, found that mandatory audit firm rotation may not be the most efficient way to strengthen auditor independence and improve auditor quality. However, the GAO also noted that several years' experience with implementation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act's reforms is needed before the full effect of the Act's requirements can be assessed. The GAO needs to update this outdated study. This amendment requires the GAO again to evaluate the potential costs and benefits of mandatory audit firm rotation now that more than 10 years have passed since the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley. The amendment requires consideration of various factors, including whether rotation would actually mitigate against conflicts of interest between audit firms and issuers, and whether audit quality could suffer due to audit firm rotation. And the study would also include an assessment of the impact of Sarbanes-Oxley on audit firm independence and whether additional reforms are needed. Importantly, this study will inform a future Congress as to the wisdom of the statutory prohibition on auditor rotation in H.R. 1564. With the adoption of my amendment, I and every member of the committee voted for this bill. Allow me to reiterate, I'm supportive of the role and mission of the PCAOB, but believe that the regulator would do well to look at the benefits to investors as it examines auditor independence. Doing so will take the PCAOB away from focusing on auditor rotation and towards other areas that provide more meaningful improvements in auditing and financial reporting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, we are prepared to close and reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from New York, my colleague, Mr. Meeks, who has put so much time and work in researching this whole issue about auditor rotation. He's worked very closely with Mr. Hurt and helped to educate the members of the committee about the difficulties and the complications of this whole issue of auditor rotation. I yield to Mr. Meeks from New York.
How much time is gentlewoman yielding?
Such time as he may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And I want to thank the gentlelady from California for all of her hard work. And I rise to support H.R. 1564, which I co-introduced with my colleague, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Hurt. And this bill ensures that we maintain strict auditing standards without imposing overly burdensome and ill-conceived rotation requirements on our public companies. But I also want to point out the hard work that the gentlelady of California put in regards to the GAO study and why it is important so that we can continue to make sure that our markets are strong and sturdy. And that amendment, as she so indicated, is what enabled us to have a unanimous agreement coming out of our committee. And it was us working together across the aisle to make sure that that happened. I think it was good for our markets. It helps to remove the uncertainty that the markets certainly would have right now had we not had this removed and have this study going forward. But let me, and I think it's important for me to emphasize that this bill does not first weaken our auditing and accounting standards, which were reinforced 10 years ago under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and that this bill does not weaken, nor do I want to weaken or remove the regulatory powers of PCAOB. But we do want to remove the uncertainty. And this bill does not in any circumstance provide an opportunity for more fraudulent accounting gimmicks. In fact, I want to remind my colleagues that we have supported and we have enacted here in the United States one of the toughest pieces of legislation against accounting fraud, and that our existing laws already embrace the concept of rotation by requiring the replacement of the lead auditing partner. This selective rotation ensures that the opinions and interpretations of the reviews remain unbiased and do not remain under the authority of the same individual for prolonged periods. And this provision puts us ahead of most developed countries when it comes to anti-fraud accounting rules, and I believe that it remains the right and smart approach. Imposing mandatory rotation of the entire auditing firm in an industry where companies often have none or at best one or two credible options to rotate to is simply unworkable, and it is disruptive, and it imposes unduly expenses on our public companies. In fact, studies conducted here in the United States show that requiring mandatory rotation would increase costs by 20% in the subsequent year, and an additional 17% of costs for selection process alone. In addition to cost, it is possible that it may actually force public companies to select less credible auditing firms that may not have the required expertise, or it may encourage the auditing firm to charge excessively high fees because mandatory rotation may impose the selection of the single remaining qualified auditing firm. Mr. Speaker, as I stated before, we did not introduce this bill simply because we were against the principle of rotation, but rather we introduced this bill because imposing rotation at all costs by any means, regardless of market conditions, would simply be irresponsible and detrimental. Many of my colleagues, and me included, do favor a more competitive auditing industry where companies can have more choices in the selection of their auditing firms. Eventually, market conditions may evolve, and we may have new auditing firms that emerge and gain the confidence of markets and investors. As that happens, firm rotation, I believe, will naturally happen through market forces, but not through legislation. It is therefore, and for that reason, Mr. Speaker, that I urge my colleagues to vote in support of H.R. 1564 and to support this common sense regulation of our auditing industry. And I thank both the chairman and the ranking member and my colleague, Mr. Hurt, who co-sponsored this, for bringing this piece of legislation forward. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, we're prepared to close.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from California have any additional speakers?
I have no additional speakers. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I would just simply close by saying I think that this is a good bill, a bill that not only strengthens investor protection, but also reduces unnecessary costs. It reduces uncertainty in the marketplace. We need certainty in the marketplace. This helps reduce that for public companies. And so it is my request that this body pass this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1564 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Mr. Speaker, we would request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.
Switching managers.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1171.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 91, H.R. 1171, a bill to amend Title 40 United States Code to improve Veteran Service Organizations' access to federal surplus personal property.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, each will control 20 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material under the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, our nation's veterans serve our country and make sacrifices for the freedom and protection that we enjoy every day. I'm deeply grateful for the brave and heroic service of all who defend our nation. H.R. 1171 permits veteran service organizations to obtain surplus federal personal property, such as electronic equipment and vehicles, to provide services to our nation's veterans. You know, there are countless individuals and organizations who want to help our veterans, yet sometimes the law and the bureaucracy will present stumbling blocks to these individuals and groups doing all they can on behalf of our veterans. And we can never truly repay our nation's veterans for the work they do, but this bill is a small and necessary step to provide essential services to those who serve. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. A gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I value and appreciate the sacrifices made by the men and women in our armed forces, and for that reason, I'm happy to rise in support of this legislation. The bill would simply amend current law to provide qualified veteran service organizations with greater access to federal surplus property. The bill enjoys bipartisan support and is non-controversial. In fact, in May of this year, it was considered by our committee, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and passed unanimously, a rarity in our history. In December 2010, President Obama signed the original Four Vets Act into law. That legislation established the eligibility of veteran service organizations to receive surplus property under the Federal Surplus Property Program. The wording of the statute suggests that those organizations should also demonstrate they are acquiring the property for the purposes of education or public health. The narrow construction of that language really hurts veteran service organizations who are not always equipped to administer public health or educational programs, that not being their core mission. They have thus been prevented, in some cases, from accessing the federal surplus property Congress intended them to access. This legislation simply corrects any confusion and, if you will, that error, to allow veterans organizations access to federal surplus property to benefit veterans. Mr. Speaker, we need to do better for our veterans, and I think this bill, H.R. 1171, is a good step forward. I urge members to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as he may consume to my distinguished colleague from the state of Michigan, Mr. Benishek.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Florida. I rise today in support of H.R. 1171, the Four Vets Act of 2013. This bipartisan legislation will allow veteran service organizations access to federal surplus property. In December 2010, President Obama signed the original Four Vets Act into law. This legislation added qualified VSOs to the list of organizations eligible to receive federal surplus property under the Federal Surplus Property Program. However, the wording of the statute requires all organizations to demonstrate that they are acquiring the property for purposes of public health or education. Unlike many of the other organizations on the list, most VSOs are not set up to administer a health or education program. A strict interpretation of the law by the General Services Administration has prevented these VSOs from accessing federal surplus as Congress has intended. Our bill would simply correct the error in current law and ensure that qualified VSOs will have the access to federal surplus that our veterans have earned. This bill has been scored by the CBO as having no significant impact on spending. In this difficult economy, veteran service organizations can use valuable service items that are considered surplus property to better serve those who have given so much to our nation. Some of these items could be a refrigerator for everyday use at a local post, or even a vehicle to be used to take disabled veterans to appointments. Last year, I spoke to a veteran in Elk Rapids, Michigan, who told me that the error in current law was preventing his AMVETS post from using federal surplus computers for unique veteran service tasks. This bill will help him and so many others like him put federal surplus property to work for our nation's veterans. I'm very proud to be part of this effort. I'm grateful to Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings and the members of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee for the unanimous support this bill received during markup on June 25th. I also want to thank the National Association of State Agencies for Surplus Property, as well as the American Legion and the Disabled American Veterans for their support and assistance in getting this legislation to this point. I urge the House to adopt this bipartisan legislation that will help veteran service organizations in every state better serve our nation's veterans. I thank the Speaker and yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia.
Before I yield back, I just want to congratulate the gentleman on his legislation. It is correcting an error, and it will make a very positive benefit for so many veterans organizations, including the ones, of course, he enumerated. So I congratulate the gentleman and proud to support the legislation. We have no other speakers on this side, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back our time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, we have no further witnesses, and I would just urge all members to support the passage of H.R. 1171, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1171? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed.
Mr. Speaker,
gentleman from Florida.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until 6:30 p.m. today.